Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we have entered day 96 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and the forces of Ukraine. And obviously, today we are hearing reports of very, very intense fighting taking place over the last relatively 24 hours. The fighting obviously continues with up to 25 battalion tactical groups of Russian forces attempting to break their way into the city of Severodonetsk. Now, we have heard reports that certain elements of the Ukrainian army is starting to back out of Severodonetsk, and we could be on the precipice of a Russian takeover of that city that sits on the eastern bank of the Severensky Donets River. Now, obviously, the fighting continues. The fighting is reportedly and anecdotally being reported as incredibly intense urban combat taking place, in which we have dug in Ukrainian formations inside of the city, continuing to resist Russian infantry formations that are attempting to maneuver into the city. We also have reports and evidence that indicates that the Russians have brought up the Terminator infantry support vehicle. It sounds like approximately 10 to 12 of those vehicles have been deployed into this area of operations. So that vehicle, the Terminator, I'm going to use it as the primary thumbnail for this video today, and you'll be able to obviously see the vehicle. But it's really an infantry support vehicle with 30 millimeter guns, and then it also possesses anti-tank guided weapons as well. So a system really designed to operate in urban or in open environments as well, and directly support main battle tanks and other infantry formations, and thus suppress the possibility of anti-tank guided weapons teams and generally the opposing force of the enemy. But again, it's reported that those systems are now being deployed in the area of Severodonetsk. But we continue to see the heavy use of Russian artillery systems along the entirety of the front line, and that's what's really causing the huge issues for the Ukrainian military at this point, is the continued use of massive amounts of Russian heavy artillery, really all along the entire length of the front line. Furthermore, some of the issues now the Ukrainian military is dealing with, and these are, again, anecdotal reports coming from the front lines. These are both lower level officers, these are non-commissioned officers, and obviously the average Ukrainian service member who is deployed on the front line, running from south of Donetsk all the way up towards Izum. And those reports indicate that the Ukrainians are starting to, one, run out of ammunition in some cases. Two, there are supply issues hampering Ukrainian forces right now. And obviously, when you are facing an opponent in the Russian army, which has the benefit of tactical air assets, and then obviously the use of huge amounts of artillery, long-range artillery, cruise missiles, you're going to see interdiction missions starting to degrade your ability to supply your forces. And one of the biggest issues right now being reported for some of these Ukrainian forces, especially those forces that are not deployed inside of some major towns and cities along the front line, but those forces that are in open fields, in more of the rural areas along the battlescape, are facing a shortage of fresh drinking water. And that is indicative of the Russian interdiction efforts, destroying water buffaloes, and the ability of the Ukrainian military to sustain itself in the field. And again, just from those anecdotal reports from the Ukrainian servicemen on the front line, it appears that that morale is starting to wane. One, because of the massive amounts of heavy artillery and the methodical way Russian forces are continuing to advance along this broad front. It's not the fact that we're seeing a lot of Russian maneuvering and enveloping and the actual mass surrender of Ukrainian forces that are cut off. That's not the primary issue for Ukrainian forces. It is the concept that they're just being bombed day in and day out, and we're starting to see the inability of Ukrainian forces at times to effectively rotate forces along the front line. So some of these forces have been on the front lines for some time, and there hasn't been a proper rotation of those forces out with new forces in to relieve them for a period of time. So if you're sitting there on the front line, you are having difficulty obtaining certain supplies, again, such as fresh water. It doesn't sound like food is a big issue, as they've been very, very, very well supplied with Western meals ready to eat. Both the United States and other European countries have supplied those, and they have the ability to obviously eat that. But again, the fresh water, the inability to bring fresh water to the front line, is of some concern for many of these Ukrainian units, and obviously that's a different factor on how you move vast amounts of water to the front line. So moving water is a bit different than moving these meal ready to eat packages, which are you can throw them in a truck or a car, speed them to the front line, and then the soldiers have access to them. The deployment and movement of water in large tanks, again, is a little bit different than the process of supplying food. And obviously they can utilize water bottles and what have you, and that is being done. But apparently one of the chief complaints on the front line right now is lack of water for some reason. Then obviously the issue with ammunition and especially heavy weapons is a real concern for a lot of the Ukrainian forces, and is causing that morale to start to wane because they are feeling it on their end in terms of the constant pressure by these 122, 130, 152 millimeter, 200 plus, 300 plus millimeter multiple launch rocket systems, tube artillery that is continuing to pound Ukrainian forces, whereas the Ukrainians are really kind of existing in terms of in terms of defending themselves, are those anti-tank guided weapons teams. And yes, they have deployed, and they do continue to deploy artillery, but they have to be much more effective in the use of that artillery, because ammunition and munitions and supplying those artillery guns with a constant stream of artillery shells is becoming more and more difficult. Now, obviously, the issue of the Ukrainians being supplied with Western armaments, that is true. They are getting some of these weapon systems in, but the vast majority of the Ukrainian military uses Soviet-era either self-propelled or towed artillery guns. Yes, they do have access to some of those Western systems. 70 to maybe 150 systems have been shipped in of those 155 M777s, but the vast majority of the Ukrainian firepower in terms of artillery are from those Russian systems that are continually being attacked with the opposing Russian systems. And then obviously the issue with producing and supplying those Russian systems with munitions. A little bit more difficult for some of these Western nations to assist the Ukrainians in the supply and distribution of those 152, 122 millimeter guns, because of the ongoing interdiction efforts by Russian forces and the ability of Russian forces to destroy the manufacturing centers and depots inside of Ukraine. And that's kind of what we're seeing. It's what we're kind of seeing now in terms of some of the problems right now on the front lines for Ukrainian forces. And then obviously, yes, obviously the Russians have had some setbacks. They faced a very difficult time in some of those river crossings that they attempted across the Donetsk River to the within the vicinity of Izum and kind of to the southeast in between Lyman and that area where I'm kind of zooming in now. And yes, the Russians did face a very, very difficult time in attempting to cross that river and did see some setbacks in that area, including quite a lot of casualties taken by Russian forces in that ongoing operation. But right now, again, it's not so much the maneuvering of Russian forces; it's just that nonstop pounding with artillery, and then these very focused assaults that are going on by Russian forces, such as what's happening in Severodonetsk, kind of what we've seen within the vicinity of Popasna, and then other areas running from just south of Kharkov all the way down to Donetsk. Yes, we continue to hear about a Ukrainian offensive operation to the it would be the northeast of Mykolaiv, and just kind of like to the northeast of Kherson as well, in the general vicinity of this area. Now, the issue for Ukrainian forces to continue this offensive is the fact that they are having to cross these rivers, just as the Russians are. And the problem for the Ukrainians is the Russians continue to use tactical air assets to then blast away at some of these Ukrainian crossings. And so the Ukrainians are kind of facing the same sort of problems the Russians are, for example, in their operations that took place on some of those river crossings further to the northeast of the Donbass that we had just seen. But right now it is a really a firepower centric battle that we are seeing, and unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Russians simply have an advantage in terms of firepower, and we keep hearing that from these anecdotal reports along the front lines about Ukrainian soldiers complaining about the obviously the lack of Ukrainian firepower versus the amounts of firepower that the Russians are delivering upon the Ukrainians. And again, and this is strictly within the scope of artillery, and then the tactical air issue as well, including gunships and Su-25 Frogfoots that are actively being used. We still see the Ukrainians fielding aircraft. Reportedly, Ukrainian MiG-29s are still engaging Russian tactical air. Now, obviously, they are not flying 24/7. A lot of their airfields have been destroyed, but they are still getting aircraft into the air, and they are able to threaten and engage Russian aircraft. While we would not say the Russians have air superiority, we would say that the Russians have air dominance in certain areas. Now, obviously, there are certain areas that the Russians will not use their tactical air assets, such as over western Ukraine, or for that matter, the Russians have become very risk adverse in terms of operating those tactical air assets over Kharkov or near Kharkov, as the Ukrainians have deployed quite a bit of anti-aircraft systems in those areas. The Ukrainians are still deploying S-300s, Buks, and then obviously man-portable systems, and they still are continuing to receive intelligence data from the United States in terms of long-range or early warning aircraft, and obviously satellite intel as well, letting the Ukrainians know where Russian forces are, and especially when tactical air assets start to deploy further west, which then allows the Ukrainians to engage some of those with their anti-air systems. But that's the report for today. Again, very, very high intensity warfare right now happening in Severodonetsk. Leading reports indicate that the city could fall within the next 24, 48 hours. Now, I would not be surprised if that does not happen. And I would not be surprised at all if it does happen, quite frankly. But at the same time, if the Russians take Severodonetsk, the next big problem is going to be a forced crossing eventually of the Severodonetsk Donetsk River, just kind of to the southwest of Severodonetsk. That's going to be very difficult, as it's been proven fairly difficult for the Russians to launch some of these very large-scale river crossings, especially with the Ukrainians having pre-plots and actively resisting some of these attempted crossings by Russian forces. In all probability, I believe we'll see a further offensive operation someplace to the southwest or northwest in terms of possible enveloping operations taking place near Popasna, or a further operation, as we've heard reports of continued Russian buildup within the vicinity of south of Zaporizhia, and I've talked about that before. One other thing to note, we have also received reports that there is another fairly large Russian buildup occurring just to the west of Kursk. Now, is this more or less a defensive operation? Is it preparing for a possible Ukrainian operation? Very, very difficult to say, but it would not be outside the realm of possibility for some sort of diversionary Russian attack towards Sumy or some other areas if, in fact, these reports of Russian buildup to the west of Kursk are, in fact, true, or it could be some sort of counter operation designed to enter Ukraine near Sumy and then kind of pivot down towards Kharkov in an attempt to negate that continued Ukrainian offensive that continues near Kharkov. But that's the report for today. Obviously, we're watching things very, very closely in terms of Severodonetsk and then other areas as well. And we will bring you more content for your consumption. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.